Hey there, my name is John, one of the pastors at Jordan Valley Church, and this is week 3 of our Gender and Sexuality study series. I'm still here, haven't been canceled yet. You're still here and watching. I think we're going to make it through. We're halfway done after this video. So thanks for sticking with us. Hopefully it's been helpful. I know I've learned a lot. Hopefully the discussions in your community groups have been fruitful, maybe difficult at times, but really I'm excited for this opportunity for us all to grow together to be more fully conformed to God's Word. Well, over the past 2 weeks, we've focused on what Scripture teaches us about gender. Now, this week, though, we are going to take a little bit different approach and look at some of the philosophical ideas and trends that led us to where we are. How did we get here? A roadmap to our identity. Now, it's no surprise that when we look at our culture, we see there is a wide gap between what Scripture says and what the predominant culture says, at least in the United States, about where we find our identity. And even within our culture, there has been a very radical shift where gender today is seen as largely a personal choice and really core to one's identity. And that is a view that would be very strange even to someone just 50 years ago in the predominant culture. So how did we get here? How did things change so quickly? Now, before we jump into that, though, let's just review some of our ground rules for the discussions that we have in our groups. First off, remember, we must love one another. These discussions are going to go a whole lot better if you seek to love each other. Second, seek to understand the other person before you respond. Don't try to win the debate or prove your point, but genuinely seek to hear other people and understand their perspective and even find something that is helpful in it. And then our third ground rule is to remember that this is more personal than you realize. Maybe someone isn't wrestling with this themselves, but it is very likely that there are people in your group that are wrestling with it in personal ways, whether with a sibling or a child or friend or loved one. And lastly, just want to remind you that it's okay to be uncomfortable, to be uncertain, to be torn, to be afraid when discussing this topic. I think we all enter into it with a little bit of fear and trepidation, and yet that shouldn't keep us from doing it. I think we will find great value in doing this together. Well, with that, let's jump into today's lesson. We want to understand some of the philosophical trends that have led us to where we are today. And a key person that we're going to use to help us is Charles Taylor. He was a Canadian philosopher who analyzed our societal and philosophical frameworks of identity. And he helps us to understand how discussions of gender identity have become so prevalent today and some of the reasons why it's difficult to even talk with someone about this subject because it is so personal. Well, what makes it so personal? A lot of these notes, just so you know, we're really the help of a few other people in the church to compile this, as this is kind of a little outside of my own expertise. But I believe they will be helpful to you. Well, there's 5 points that we want to note in this discussion. First is a shift of identity from external things to internal things. That what caused people to form their identity moved from being external to internal. Second, the challenges or pitfalls of society's view of identity, known as individualism or self-determination. What are some of the challenges when we have an individualistic or self-deterministic view of identity? Then we want to understand an overreaction against this individualism. That's 3. And 4, how this framework of identity impacts our gender identity. How does the wider conversation about identity and the shifts in that impact one's sense of gender identity? And then finally, we want to look at where is it that we are to find our identity. So first, the shift from external to internal identity. The idea of individualism isn't anything new, but it is much more prominent today. Individualism is really part of the air we breathe as Americans. and it thrives in democratic and even more so in capitalistic societies. So Charles Taylor notes that individualism really took root in the 17th century. And this was in part because this is when entrepreneurship and capital, as in money and resources and the allocation of capital, became some of the dominant modes and values in life. So humans moved from a feudal and largely agricultural system and into systems of commerce where people focused on enterprise and business and allocation and movement of capital. And individualism then kicked into an even higher gear with the advent of democracy, with the Lockean philosophy of rights. And these are many of the same ideologies that undergird our very democratic state. So we can see under a democratic government with a high value or emphasis on individual rights, each person then has equal right or equal value in that system. Each person gets a vote, each person gets a say, each person has these inalienable rights. And therefore, every person has an equal right to be recognized. Now, this is something that, by and large, was good. We are all made in God's image. But we need to recognize that it can also be distorted, and sin can corrupt it and lead it to unhealthy extremes. And so these forces, moving out of feudalism into capitalism, democratic society, led to individualism being even more powerful. We can think of it this way, that now I have the ability to choose my work. Right? The idea that we ask so many of our kids these days, what is it you want to be when you grow up? Well, that would be a really kind of rare or unheard of question a few hundred years ago, because it wasn't that long ago that your profession was largely chosen for you, especially for men, based on what your father did. Well, that's what you were going to do. But now you can choose your career. You can find something that excites you. And democracy then also empowered the individual to choose their leaders, another thing that was really unheard of in the scope of human history. And so individualism now becomes more and more powerful. And so my individualism, or my self-fulfillment and my rights, can only be limited when our self-fulfillment prevents someone else's self-fulfillment. So we see this shift where that in one sense that you can do whatever it is you want to do as long as it doesn't hurt someone else. J.S. Mill famously said that we have the right to do whatever we want to do as long as it does not hurt another person. We have the right to do whatever we want to do as long as it does not hurt another person. Now we should note that this was back in the late 1700s, early 1800s that this idea was taking place, and yet we can see even in that the seeds for a modern gender identity. And while democracy and capitalism have many benefits, one of the imperfect outcomes of this has been that individualism was able to grow perhaps even too far. It loosened the demands of commitment outside of us. To put it maybe more simply, I became more important than us. Instead of being a collective society, we became an individualistic society. So democracy and capitalism laid this foundation for individualism to have a prominent role, not just in your sense of self, but in politics and economics. Now, how did this shift then enter into the world of morals and ethics, and ultimately our identity? Well, Taylor points to a shift in morality and philosophy. Philosophy in the form of postmodernism and existentialism in the early 20th century began to focus more on the self. Before this time, the common philosophical view of ethics and metaphysics, which is just a fancy word for how we interpret the world, was that humans were primarily thinking beings, meaning that we attempt to think through problems through logic and reason, and we expect humans to react in rational and reasonable ways. So that science and reason had become the common basis for understanding the world. For those who took Philosophy 101, if you went to college, Descartes famously wrote, "I think, therefore I am," is maybe one of the most famous examples of this idea, of this rationalism. But the existential philosophies in the mid-20th century and postmodern philosophers resisted that idea that we are merely human or thinking beings, that we're not just purely logical. But they believe that humans are much more complicated and that we don't kind of analyze things from kind of like a computer, but we have our own biases and our own senses of meaning that influence how we interpret and interact with the world. What really determined the world was how I interpret and engage the world with my own biases and influences. So the value of objects and people and decisions are no longer determined simply by science or reason, but rather these things earned their value because of the meaning or how I determine them to be. The development into this thought was that we humans determine the value of our existence because we assign meaning to it rather than having it have some sort of intrinsic value in itself. And in that statement, you can hear echoes of Judith Butler's later idea that gender is performative, that it is not something intrinsic into our bodies, but it is something that we can make our own meaning of what it means. So the existentialist says, my ethical or moral approach to the world is derived from my existence and the meaning I import on these things, not derived from something outside of me, such as science or religion. Put it another way, my meaning is derived from how I interpret things, not how others tell me what is important, whether it's a culture or a religion or authoritative books or texts. Nietzsche then took this approach to morality and ethics. He believed that the truly ethical person was the one that determined his own morality. He became the Übermensch, the superhuman, where the only morality is no morality, he said, which eventually led to nihilism, which means nothing matters in the end. So the promise of existentialism, postmodernism, and Nietzsche became this promise of unparalleled power and freedom to define your own existence, to make yourself into the person you want to be, to have complete freedom to be whatever it is you want to be. I am the one who gets to determine my own fate and my own life. And therefore no one can impose their morality on me. Again, these ideas seem, very recent, but it's helpful to know that the seed for these ideas really was rooted in trends and philosophies that were more than 100 years old. And this has led to what we call moral subjectivism, that no one can tell me what is right or wrong, only myself. And therefore external reason or morality can have no hold over me. Now, until relatively recently in human history, meaning was always found in something outside of us, beyond us, whether that be politics or the state or God or the good or other ideals. But where existentialists found freedom in choice to choose who you want to be, Nietzsche found freedom in morality, you decide what is good. The philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau found freedom in self-determinism or identity formation. Freedom becomes when I determine for myself what concerns me rather than external influence, whether that be God or politics or other people. Meaning or freedom is found through self-determination. And this self-determining freedom demands that I break free of all external impositions and decide for myself alone. It's the idea of follow your own heart. And this had something of a destabilizing effect on society, because as one generation accepts a new social norm, the following generation, to be free, has to reject that prior norm and come up with some new norm. And so there is no stability in society, all in trying to chase true authenticity, to free yourself from the shackles of previous generations. And so it is by breaking free from external impositions can I become my true self. And we hear this very much today, that phrase, be true to yourself. But what does it mean to be true to yourself? Charles Taylor gives one explanation. He writes, being true to myself means being true to my own originality. And that is something only I can articulate and discover. In articulating it, I am also defining myself. I am realizing the potentiality that is properly my own. Now notice, in this idea of be true to yourself, the only reference point someone has is themselves. Nothing external. In fact, anything external just gets in the way from you being your true self is. And this helps to explain why in today's culture there is such a rejection of historical institutions and traditions in favor of an internal validation of what I want to do. So this quick kind of overview, and I realize it may have been a bit complicated, so feel free to listen to it again or ask questions, gets us to some of the main philosophical trends and ideas that bring us to where we are today. That in our own culture, we don't even realize this, but all of us are seeking to be authentic and original, and we long to be true to ourselves without the demands that have been externally placed on us. And it's important to note that this has affected all of us. We all ask ourselves, who am I? And Taylor says that while society has become very self-centered, there's also been kind of a counteracting force of rejecting this idea of authenticity altogether. That the meaning of life is not in finding your true self, but just simply what you can do with your life, about how much you can produce, or how pleasurable a life you can have, or how much you can alleviate suffering in life. A common example of this is in our consumeristic culture, right? That, I don't really care about who I am as long as I have a big house and a boat and maybe a vacation home and the latest, greatest toys and clothes and such. That life is not driven by my contribution to a better society, but rather my life is driven by my own attainment of a good life, of pleasure. Now, we would reject the idea that life has no meaning and that all we are here to do is eat, drink, and be merry and then die. And Charles Taylor likewise denies rejecting the ideal of authenticity altogether, but he also rejects the idea that authenticity and identity has to be derived internally. Rather, he thinks we should rescue authenticity. So what he's saying here is not to reject, say, you know what, don't worry about who you are, just go out and have fun. He says that's not true. He also rejects, though, that authenticity is only found in yourself. Instead, he's calling us to redeem a healthier authenticity. It would be hard to find somebody who gives no weight to how certain life choices would fulfill them. We all have kind of a selfish bent to ourselves. The problem, though, is in our modern society, self-fulfillment has become too important, or the only criteria that really matters is what is going to make you happy. That's good to think about, but it's not the only thing to think about. And Taylor instead argues that true authenticity is found in this tension between that self-fulfillment, but also the demands of our communities and ethics and institutions. The greatest authenticity is this healthy balance of myself and my community and what is good. So the way that we redeem this ideal authenticity is by showing that we are part of a bigger story, that no person is completely isolated from everybody else, and your actions actually have an impact on other people, that we need to see how we are all intertwined, whether in little ways or big ways. And so what we should want to do is to find more robust ideas of authenticity instead of a kind of simplistic idea of being authentic to yourself. In other words, a life where you're wrapped up in yourself is not a truly fulfilling life. Another aspect is that we must realize that we are eternal beings, and what will fulfill us for eternity is bigger than what our hearts might want right now. That we should be suspicious of just following your heart, because so often your heart has a very short time horizon and is not considering all of eternity. But as eternal beings, we need something to match the eternity that we were made for. As Augustine famously wrote in his Confessions, our hearts are restless until they rest in you, speaking of God. And Augustine realized that as eternal beings, we needed to be shaped by something, filled by something external, which can only be Christ. Christ is the only being big enough to shape us and to fill us. So, now how does gender identity fit within our culture's idea or framework of authenticity? An authenticity that is very me-focused. We again need to remember that this idea of gender identity is relatively new. It's not something that we would have discussed in the same way 20 years ago, let alone 100 years ago. And so as we try to understand what's brought us here, our analysis of culture through the eyes of Charles Taylor will help with part of the story, but it is very complex. As Taylor showed, our culture either affirms authenticity as finding yourself and exploring yourself internally, or there's a reaction against this view and dismisses the idea of authenticity and instead just promotes a form of hedonism, right? To eat, drink, and be merry. And as we think of gender identity, it was not common to think about gender as an identity until recently. But when we look at the descriptions of gender identity, we see that the cultural philosophy of the day of identity and authenticity is really underlying so many of these beliefs and articulations of gender identity. So consider that many who have gender dysphoria describe their identified gender as not matching their biological sex. Remember, there's been a break between sex and gender. That they say there's something internal about how I feel that contradicts the external aspect of my body. And so when we listen to those with different gender identities or non-binary people, the language they use is very personal. It's very internal, right? This is who I am. This is how I feel. But when we get back to Charles Taylor and his argument against hyper-individualism, he argues that humans are dialogical. Now, dialogical just means that we are always living in dialogue with others. We are always interacting with others, whether we like it or not. We cannot be fully isolated with no external interaction. Therefore, while we want to be fully authentic, to self-determine what my identity is, because we're dialogical, because we always live in community, because we're always in dialogue with others, we cannot develop this internal sense of identity with not at the same time wanting that identity to be validated by others that are external to us. We need external validation. And so there is then this tension. We can create, in our modern society, our identity internally, but we want it affirmed externally. And so we need to convince those externally about what we feel on the inside. Now, this might not entirely explain gender-affirming care, but we can ask the question, how are we so sure that changing the external biological body to better align with an internal feeling is the right or best approach? Does not perhaps the external speak something true as well? Though again, we can see in our culture why the internal takes priority. And perhaps those with gender dysphoria desire to reflect their internal identity before others by changing their body to reflect that internal feeling, and then also receive reassurance from others who recognize them in their body as how they feel inside, whether as a man or woman. And even if someone does not identify as their biological sex or take steps to transition, they may often ask others to refer to them by certain pronouns. And maybe this is another way that they are seeking external affirmation of an internal identity that they've determined. Because we live dialogically, and when we reject the external to develop the internal, though, realizes it can't be fully isolated. It still needs to engage with other humans. We were meant to be in relationships. And therefore, the internal identity wants to step outside to have others affirm that it is true and good. So then people, we can understand, will want to change their external appearance to ease that dialogical tension with how they feel inside. A contentious aspect of this topic is that we have to recognize that when someone identifies in a way that is different from their birth sex, they really do see it as part of their identity, that this is core to who they are. And because we live in a democratic society that gives equal value and recognition to anyone's identity, right, the very kind of cultural air that we breathe says you must recognize these people's identities. And thus, by not recognizing someone as they identify, means we do not recognize them as a fully equal person as we would in our democratic norms. Remember, these democratic norms are very individualistic, how they press individual rights, maybe even above the community. And so the politics of identity and finding that identity internally, if your internal identity is not recognized by others, it feels as if you are not being recognized for your true self. And that can feel disrespectful or even harmful. Now, some may argue that no true damage is being done, but we should recognize that when people believe, because of our culture, that their greatest source of truth is within, that their most authentic self is on the inside, to have someone not acknowledge that which is believed to be deeply personal and true is hurtful. And it feels like your very self is being attacked. And as Christians, people called to love, while speaking truth, we cannot simply dismiss how this can hurt others. And so we see here similar dynamics to what Taylor has described for authenticity. It is developed internally, but needs to be affirmed externally. And perhaps that is why pronouns have become such a big deal. So far, we've seen how the modern sense of identity has developed our gender identity. Our gender identity really comes out of that modern sense of identity. We also need to see how our society is structured to really accelerate the very rapid changes we've seen in this front. Taylor notes that in a similar way, that democracy and capitalism has elevated the self, the individual. He also shows that in our industrial capitalistic society, we have come to believe that mobility is something that naturally happens as we move for career opportunities. We take mobility for granted. It's not a big deal to go move somewhere else for a job or to switch jobs or this sort of thing. Whereas not that long ago, people, by and large, would stay in the same communities that they were born in and never leave them. And this mobility, which has had many benefits, we must also recognize has come with a cost. And that cost has often been in depths of relationships. Relationships become more casual, less serious, less committed. We can very easily make a decision to uproot from where we are to pursue a better opportunity without consulting the community. Because we know we might only be in a place for a few years, we don't invest in that place. Because we fear the pain of leaving or knowing that someone else might leave. We feel that relationships or deep relationships might be a waste of time. And all these things then have come to create more casual relationships and contact and connections with others, rather than the rooted and meaningful relationships that humans have historically enjoyed. And furthermore, we have access to all kinds of choices and opportunities. This is what Taylor calls mobility, and that mobility brings benefits. But again, as we said, it brings consequences of less deeply rooted relationships and not as thick communities. And then this has only been exacerbated by the prominence and development of social media. Social media, in some ways, promised to connect us in a mobile society. And yet what it ended up doing is maybe we have many more connections, but we have fewer true friends. Social media allows kind of a faux relationship. It helps us to feel like we're connected, but those relationships are very shallow. And these relationships become easier to break when we find disagreement with someone. It's way easier to unfriend someone on Facebook than it is in real life. And then when maybe your previous community is not affirming of you, you can go find another community that better aligns with your own views, that gets you or affirms what you want to believe. And there's a good chance that the relationships that we develop on social media aren't really reflecting of our true self. They don't really represent us. I mean, how many of us put our true, raw, sinful selves on social media versus a version of ourselves that we want to show? And when everyone's putting a version of themselves that they want to show, the relationships that form with those versions of us are not true and deep relationships. And so the unfortunate consequence of social media is that we can find community without having to deal with the real messiness of life. There's a good chance that you can form an identity internally and then go find an echo chamber online that will affirm that identity while never holding you accountable. Because if they do, well, you just leave and find another one. And instead of learning to build relationships with the people closest to you, your neighbors, which can be difficult because you need to learn to get along, to work through differences. You aren't exactly the same. You see things differently. You argue about things that neighbors can feel tension about and have to work those things through. Well, nowadays, you can just ignore your neighbors and find a community online that completely affirms you. Now, this doesn't necessarily sound bad, but the thing is, if you're never challenged, but completely affirmed with whatever desires you have, you can never truly improve or grow. But in some ways, just become a bad form of yourself. And social media has also led to the explosion of personal exploration, where you can present certain identities online that, again, aren't exactly fully or truly reflective of yourself. Now, humans have been doing this for centuries, but social media has made it all the easier. It may be a step too far to say that social media has directly led to the prevalence of gender identity questions, but many believe it's had a significant effect. We'll talk more about this next week, but one of the reasons for that is in the incredible growth of what's often termed rapid onset gender dysphoria. And why is it all of a sudden there's this incredible spike, especially amongst females, in this? One reason social media has had such an effect on gender dysphoria is that, well, online you can find affirmation for whatever you believe in an online group. And you can bypass the physical dialogue and give and take that we've traditionally experienced. And if you don't like the physical dialogue, well, you can just go online where you're completely affirmed. And it's easier then to explore these identities anonymously online. Many point to the website Tumblr in the 2010s as one of the first locations for teenagers and young adults to explore their gender identity. And many, for the first time, could go online and create identities and explore in forums and experience affirmation of these newly created identities. In some instances, people have noted that hundreds of gender identities were created on Tumblr. Once again, we see where an internally developed identity still longs for external affirmation. You want people to affirm who you are. But the challenge or disadvantage of when this is entirely online and anonymous is it bypasses physical dialogue, intimate community, the challenges in the back and forth that cause us to grow. And instead, you're just affirmed, but you might be being affirmed in things that are actually harmful for you. One good podcast that we'd recommend you listen to that explores some of these dynamics is called The Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling, which she's the author of the Harry Potter series and yet has been very vocal on some of these topics. And it's a great podcast that explores these dynamics. Well, we understand at least a little bit how we got here. And hopefully this wasn't too complicated and you could follow some of the streams and certainly bring up questions in the community groups. But I want us to wrap up by thinking some about how has the modern identity impacted all of us, right? That this idea of a gender identity is one kind of offspring of the modern identity, but we would be naive to think it hasn't affected us in the church or Christians or the way we think about things as well. Where are we guilty of trying to shape our identity internally rather than submitting ourselves to some external authority? How are we guilty of following influencers or pages that affirm our identities and our beliefs? Even the idea that you can read news that aligns with your political identity or political beliefs is an offspring of this modern gender identity or this modern sense of identity. How often do we cut out relationships in our life with people that we don't agree with? How often do we not go into that difficult work of learning to love our physical neighbors because it's much easier just to find an accepting community online? How often are we willing to leave a church because it doesn't align with our political views? This is a serious dynamic that really has exploded these last few years and will only probably increase, that more and more Christians, according to a Lifeway research study, join churches because of their political identity more than their theology, with 50% of Protestant believers preferring to attend a church that agrees with their political choices over their theology. And how do we often elevate our individual rights, our individual preferences or desires over what is good for the community or the broader church? It's important to recognize that there have been all kinds of issues that have sprung up because of the shift in identity. And we need to be vigilant in fighting against an identity that is shaped internally and not balanced by external sources. Well, to then close, what externally needs to shape us? As Taylor noted, authenticity, the formation of our identities, is redeemed when you understand that you are part of a greater whole, that you're not by yourself. And while Taylor only notes that we should be shaped by something external, he doesn't say what that external thing is. But as Christians, we can say the solution is to find our identity in Christ. As Taylor argues, we will be shaped by internal experience, external influences, and dialogue with those around us. And so it's all the more important to understand, who do we surround ourselves with? Who are we having conversations with? What communities are we part of? This will have an impact on our identity. And are these communities and groups People that are holding to some time-tested standard, or is it merely a community that will simply affirm whatever it is you say? This is why it's so crucial to be in community with the church, to worship together as a church, to have a church that's made up of different voices and perspectives, and not just a church that agrees with everything that you agree with. And so the church, in response to hyper-individualism in our culture, which manifests in this gender identity, or the other ways that this hyper-individualism manifests, the church has the opportunity to be a witness here to show there is a better identity to be found in Christ. To show the world that there is a true authenticity, but it doesn't come in discovering yourself, but in dying to yourself and discovering Christ, who will make you truly human again. That Christ is the true and the one answer to discovering who you are and actually becoming who you were made to be. Well, that's all for this week. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully you have good discussions in your groups. And I'll see you next week when we jump into understanding some of the transgender arguments.